There are entire movies, TV series, and libraries filled with stories of humans duking it out in famous battles over the centuries. But the thing that keeps me up at night with my standard issue millennial anxiety is, what about the battles that never happened?
For every firefight, bombing run, or major war campaign, there are countless other ones that were imagined, even planned and prepped for, but for whatever reason, never actually occurred.
Today we'll be putting on our alternative history hats and dive into the fights that never were, how they were expected to play out, and what would have happened if they did. And first, we're going to start out with the American Spring Offensive of 1919. Although the Americans joined World War I a little late in February of 1917, they gradually played a bigger and bigger role. By spring of 1918, the United States decided to come up with a plan, one that would finally put an end to what had been the most devastating conflict in human history up to that point. Loosely referred to as the 1919 campaign or 1919 offensive, it would have been a pivotal and final shift in the war. For the majority of World War I, American units were typically placed in support and subordinate roles under European leadership. The 1919 offensive, however, would have been American planned and operated, with U.S. forces providing the majority of the combat power.
The man behind this idea was General John Blackjack Pershing, who was the head of American Expeditionary Forces commander during the war. Even though Germany and its allies were collapsing on all fronts by 1918, many Americans in the war had a large concern. Germany still had millions of troops, and both sides of their borders were blanketed in deep defensive positions. If an armistice was signed and a ceasefire established, many believed that the Huns would just use that as an opportunity to regroup and reorganize. Americans wanted a final, decisive, definitive blow, one that would crush any hopes or ideas of rearming for a round two. The primary attack focus would be through Lorraine, France. It was chosen because the region was less devastated than other areas of intense fighting, meaning more suitable for large maneuvers, specifically those centered around tank attacks. Once through Lorraine, the Americans would push east, smashing through any remaining German defenses and march directly toward the Rhine.
The plan called for up to 100 divisions, over double the 40 or so that were already present in 1918. I know I just casually threw out the phrase 100 divisions, but in total that would have been roughly 2.8 million troops, all fighting in the exact same campaign. It doesn't even include things like support troops or artillery crews, engineer units, logistics guys, or medical staff. Those are 2.8 million combat troops specifically. It is a mind-boggling, barely comprehensible amount of people, and would have been the largest military force the United States had ever amassed in its entire history as a country. While the Germans surrendered in 1918, to really no one's surprise, the 1919 offensive would have been a type of campaign that history had never really seen before and wouldn't see until the opening stages of World War II. The plan was to use combined arms maneuver warfare, largely centered around tanks, with infantry and artillery providing support. Most of World War I was fought using something loosely called sequential warfare, where instead of everything happening at once in concert with each other, things like artillery strikes, infantry charges, and tank maneuvers would only occur one at a time, one after the other.
Instead of piecemeal assaults, General Pershing wanted constant pressure on the German lines from start to finish. He didn't want to give them a chance to stay organized or counterattack when they lost ground. Phase 1 would have begun in the winter of 1918, prepping troops, re-equipping them, and stockpiling ammunition. It would be the first major introduction to a new bit of firearms kit, the Penderson device. These essentially converted the American M1903 bolt actions everyone carried around into a semi-automatic weapon firing pistol caliber ammo. This would have allowed troops to have better short-range effectiveness, especially when clearing trenches and bunkers.
Phase 2 would begin sometime in the spring after temperatures began to rise and the ground began to thaw, with all hands on deck dumping an absolute metric ton of tank and artillery ordnance into German positions in Lorraine. Once a breakthrough was achieved, the Central Powers would collapse, the Allied forces would flood Germany, and victory would have been declared. Though Germany wasn't looking too hot by 1918, casualties were still expected to be very high. It was expected that a growingly desperate German military would increase their use of things like chemical weapons in order to cause as much damage on the Americans as possible.
But World War I ended November 11th, 1918. Pershing never got to have his march to the Rhine, and the vast majority of America's new Penderson devices, along with all the ammunition that they had for it, got dumped into the ocean. The US wanted to keep them a secret from prying eyes, and apparently wasn't worried that the fish could reverse engineer military firearms. Of course, as we all know, World War I Part 2 did happen a couple of decades later, and with it hundreds of battles that never left the planning room, or were cut short. These included Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of mainland Britain, or the American invasion of Japan, known as Operation Downfall. Seriously badass names, by the way. Shout out to whichever war planner came up with those dope-ass operational names.
We need to find their great-grandchildren and conscript them and just make them name stuff. But there is one operation, also with a cool name, by the way, that would have radically changed human history if it ever actually happened. The others would have basically concluded the war, as it was expected to, but this one would have changed everything, and that is Operation Unthinkable in 1945. As soon as the ink dried on the World War II peace treaty, the already lukewarm relations between the Western Allies and the Soviets went totally ice cold. The writing was on the wall for what was going to come next, and in May of 1945, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered the creation of plans to take on the Ruskies. This plan wasn't some back-of-the-napkin operational sketch. It was a fully flushed-out plan generated by British planning staff that was as simple as it was just completely unhinged. The Red Army was sitting on roughly 11 million troops occupying Eastern Europe, with T-34s parked from Berlin to the Balkans. Churchill was deeply concerned that if the Soviets weren't checked right at that very moment, they would just never leave those now occupied areas. Poland, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, all of it would be permanently absorbed into Moscow's sphere, and World War II would just gradually roll into World War III.
The idea was simple. Conduct a surprise attack against the USSR in July of 1945 and kick them the fuck out of Berlin. However, its viability was a stretch to say the least. To pull this off, the British planning staff made a few planning assumptions. First, that this would be full commitment effort from the Americans and the British. Second, was that the Polish military units would join in to reestablish the pre-war government that had been in exile. And third, and here's the kicker really, they would rearm the German Wehrmacht that had just been disarmed 2 months prior and send them marching east. Churchill wanted an aggressive but limited war with a clearly established goal: get Russia out of Germany and Poland. It wasn't exactly the pre-war balance of power everyone was hoping for, but it at least didn't put half of Europe under communism. Timing for this would have been critical. So the US and UK were already well established in Europe and fully mobilized. Germany had not yet been demobilized, and the Soviet forces were still stretched at their farthest advance and had not yet consolidated their gains.
British and American troops would have launched from northern Germany, more than likely, down into Berlin, using German soldiers to take the remainder of what was left of the country, and then, using Polish soldiers, push into Poland and kicking Ivan out. On paper, the West had superior air power, better logistics, and naval dominance, and that's great and all, but in reality, the Soviets had an overwhelming numerical superiority on the ground where it really mattered more. At best, the Western Allies would have amassed 2.5 million against the USSR's 11 million. Just in tanks alone, the Red Army outnumbered Western forces by something like 3-1. And the Soviets had just spent 4 years learning how to grind entire countries into paste.
Those opposed to this plan, which was basically everyone not literally named Prime Minister Winston Churchill, argued that it was impossible fight to win. It also could backfire if the Soviets decided they wanted all of Europe, not just part of it. In stereotypical polite manners, British planning officials described this plan as hazardous, beyond our power to win against heavy odds, and fanciful. The idea never left the drawing board and actually was never made public until 1998. Though the Soviets had been made aware of it nearly as soon as it was drafted, it eventually morphed into a loose post-war plan to defeat a Soviet push into Western Europe. Luckily, the Cold War between the Soviets and NATO never went hot, as long as you don't count the dozens of proxy wars causing millions of deaths and trillions spent on both sides saber-rattling along the Iron Curtain.
But no one counts those. Those don't count. Vietnam,
Nah.
Korea,
Never heard of it.
Afghanistan, don't count. Cold War was cold. No one died. The whole point of the name.
Duh.
But if said Cold War did go hot, the opening battle between East and West was expected to occur at the famous, or rather infamous, battle for the Fulda Gap. This was the low-lying region along central Germany where both NATO and Soviet forces would duke it out with every tank, helicopter, and infantryman they could possibly squeeze into it. It was basically the Disney last pass of World War III, being the easiest routes that both armies could attack each other. On the side of the Americans was the U.S. Army's 5th Corps, and their job was to go toe-to-toe with the Soviets' 8th Guards Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army. The 8th were there to batter the capitalist pigs until an opening in the defenses was found, and the 1st Guards tanks would exploit the penetration. These were the best and most well-equipped units that both sides had to offer, with the latest and greatest Cold War tech possible.
On the ground were roughly 690,000 NATO defenders against 1.1 million Warsaw Pact attackers. Both sides were postured and ready to fight at a moment's notice. With them were 11,829 NATO tanks versus 29,305 Soviet ones. Those are weirdly specific numbers, but we're going to trust our historical sources on this one. For the airspace, the West had 4,150 aircraft and the commies had 4,506. And those are just the forces expected to fight in the opening hours in this specific fight. While the Soviets outnumbered NATO armies on the attack, attackers by nature suffer more casualties than defenders. That made the fight relatively even, especially when you take into account the vehicle and equipment quality differences between the two countries. When you have two sides in a battle that are relatively even, that's generally when the fighting becomes the hardest and most intense and protracted.
The Battle of the Fulda Gap would have been less of a big firefight and more of a continental-sized meat grinder. Both sides wargamed this scenario for literal decades, and every square inch of land had already been accounted for. Every road was assigned a phase line, every bundle of trees had an assigned fire mission, and every bridge had at least 5 plans on how to blow it up. In the opening minutes, long-range Soviet artillery and airstrikes would take place, targeting key NATO units and infrastructure. Russian engineers would attempt to breach static defensive lines and minefield, while Soviet scouts looked for weak points. The U.S. Army's 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment was tasked with being the first line of defense. Their job was to engage the commies as long as they realistically could as a screening force, identifying where and how the Russians were conducting this attack specifically. When the heat got a little too hot, it would then conduct a massive regimental fighting withdrawal, which is not easy, calling in every bit of artillery and air power they could get.
This phase of the operation was expected to last about 36 to 48 hours. By then, American 5th Corps would push up, focusing on creating defensive strongpoints along major Soviet lines of attack. So their job would have been to stop the horde of T-72 and BMPs that were flooding Germany. Most war games depicted this section of the fight as an absolute slugfest, with massive tank-on-tank fighting, mechanized infantry charges, and more artillery than anyone knew what to do with. This second part of the fight was the most critical portion of the plan. Warsaw Pact doctrine was built around the idea of building up speed and momentum, crashing through Western lines before a real fight could really be organized. If NATO defeated that momentum, there went basically half of the USSR's entire war plan.
In an ideal scenario, NATO would funnel Russian forces into specific choke points, centered around specific towns, bridges, and forts that were all easily defendable, where the West would mass fires and inflict as many casualties as humanly possible. But stopping that advance was only phase 2 of how NATO planners envisioned the fighting going. After 96 hours or so, the front lines of fighting were expected to stabilize as both sides flooded the region with troops, but neither gained a decisive strategic maneuver advantage. Strike aircraft and long-range MLRS batteries would pummel Russian supply lines, engineering assets, command posts, and interdeck reinforcements coming in. This would effectively cut off Russian units that were engaged in the attack from their supporting elements back in the rear.
By then, NATO would gradually whittle away at Russia's units that were stranded on the front, while Soviet commanders struggled to coordinate the assault. That was assuming they hadn't been blasted by some M270 fire mission already. Commie lines would collapse. America stays an undefeated world champ. Then everyone goes home to their loving pre-internet homes and sings Kumbaya or some shit. At least that was the plan on paper. War games and third parties alike all came to the same rough conclusion. Even if nukes never made an appearance, and that's a really, really big if, there was still a really good chance that Russia would have taken a lot of ground, then rapidly pushed through Western defenses, and a fight for the control of Western Europe would have erupted in earnest.
Regardless of outcome, casualties were expected to be in the tens of thousands per day, according to public figures. A hefty majority of those losses were expected to come from Russia. However, that was kind of already in their budget, so to speak. At no point did they plan to win elegantly. Additionally, even though nukes were expected to be off the table for both sides in this specific battle, chemical attacks were not. While very much not ideal, if you're rapidly losing Germany to the Soviet horde, firing off a few canisters suddenly becomes very tempting.
But what is today's battle that never happened? The one we're all gearing up for that will eventually be forgotten once no one actually fires a shot. In the current nothing ever happens state of affairs, there are quite a few options. Russia versus NATO is back on the menu after a brief hiatus. North Korea and South Korea bickering never stopped since the 1950s ceasefire. And Venezuela's looking pretty prime for many American officials. But the real big one right now that keeps every defense planner stressed and overcaffeinated is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. When, even if this would happen, is the source of many a debate all the way from the highest levels of government down to the smoothest brain Twitter arguments.
Unlike the previous battles that never happened, that largely just relied on smashing the other side into oblivion, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would have to be the operational equivalent of a finely tuned Swiss watch. Like an actual Swiss watch, not a Chinese knockoff of a Swiss watch. China has undergone massive military overhauls over the last decade, upgrading everything from bootlaces to their entire aircraft fleet. On top of that, they have built the largest naval fleet by hull count, set up entire theater commands just for Taiwan alone, and trained beach landings like it's going out of style.
Observing where China's put the most rehearsal efforts, where they're doing that the greatest amount of effort, gives us a good idea of what their strategy looks like for this fight. It would start with missile attacks, followed by naval blockade, airspace denial, and finally amphibious landing. And of course, all of this would be wrapped in a cozy, nice blanket of electronic and drone warfare. Taiwan, knowing that they can't out-China China, has focused Operation Army's threat specifically.
Everyone from unnamed three-letter agencies to armchair generals on Reddit has wargamed how this battle would actually go. While Xi Jinping isn't exactly posting the results of those in Chinese for everyone to see, most Western ones generally come to the same conclusion. China doesn't manage to fully take over Taiwan, although Taiwan proper itself is effectively destroyed in the process. Casualties rapidly rise into the hundreds of thousands in the first few weeks alone between both sides, and untold civilian suffering on top of that. You can't have displaced civilians if you have nowhere for them to go. Going to be caught in the middle of it regardless. China's fleet, for the most part, would be floundering metal on the bottom of the ocean, next to shot down American planes and Japanese landing craft. Recovery would take decades, cause historic economic fallout around the world, and generally just make life worse for all of mankind.
When you zoom out and look at all these together, the 1919 American Spring Offensive, Operation Unthinkable, the Fulda Gap, and now Taiwan, a pattern starts to emerge. The battles that never happened weren't canceled because people suddenly woke up and decided that, war's bad and evil. It didn't happen because the math got too ugly too fast. In 1918, the Germans knew what was coming and surrendered before America could unleash a force so large it would have permanently rewritten European history and the entire physical landscape of that region. In 1945, Churchill realized that beating Hitler didn't automatically mean you could beat Stalin without lighting the continent on fire and risking your entire nation. During the Cold War, NATO and the Warsaw Pact stared at each other across Germany for decades, fully aware that the opening battle would be so violent it probably wouldn't stay non-nuclear for very long.
And today, Taiwan sits in that same uncomfortable category as a conflict everyone prepares for, rehearses for, and studies obsessively while desperately hoping they never have to find out if the spreadsheets were right. None of these plans were funded, rehearsed, and updated constantly. And that's really the ironic part, because the more both sides of a battle train, fund, and arm up for the actual fight itself, the deadlier it ends up becoming, and the less it becomes worth it.
Thank you guys so much for watching another episode of FailSafe. We really are happy to have you here. And if you're interested, check out one of these other videos that we think you'll really dig.